Good morning. Good morning, Michigan. It's good to be here. Thank you for being up so early with me today. I appreciate it. How many, show of hands, how many of you are normally up at this time in the morning? A lot of you. How many of you are excited to be up at this time in the morning? Fewer hands. Okay, to be expected. Again, thank you so much. I'm honored and excited to be here. Thank you for choosing to wake up early and spend some time with me. My name is Damian Sinadinos. I'm with Ineffable Solutions. This is Trust But Verify Explained. I'm going to talk about both those topics today and hopefully make it worth your time. So, let's start with trust. Everything that we think, do, or say to some degree is dependent upon trust. So I want to start there. Trust is a huge topic. It's very, very complex. There's lots of different types of trust. There's lots of different theories around trust. And if theories beget models. There's lots and lots of different models and books and people that talk about trust. There was a meta-study in 2023 that looked at trust-related studies, looked at over 5,000. They pared it down to a little over 300 that met their criteria for inclusion in the study. And they looked at all these different models of trust, and they found many differences, but some core commonalities that rose to the top among all of them. And those are the things I'm going to talk about today. It's also an unsettled topic. Trust is a topic that's been discussed for centuries, and it's unsettled. There's no consensus on exactly what trust is, which is why you have varying definitions. So definitions are sometimes a good place to start when you're trying to learn about a topic. So let's start with some definitions. Socrates says, the beginning of wisdom is the definition of terms. Let's start there. Here's some definitions of trust. It's a firm belief in the truth, confidence or faith in a person or thing, acceptance without evidence. This is essentially what trust is. Now, there's something to note. I'm going to talk a lot about trust today, but trust is not binary. Many people think about trust as being you do trust it or don't trust it, and that's it. It's black and white. But in fact, trust exists on a continuum. There's shades and degrees of trust. You may really, really, really trust something, and you're over on the left-hand side. You wholeheartedly trust something. But some things you trust a little less, and some things even less than that. Sometimes you're in the middle, where you neither trust it or don't trust it. And as you move more towards the right, you might say, I really don't trust that, or I really, really don't trust that. And you keep adding reallys until it becomes more reasonable to just call it mistrust or distrust. These are synonyms that mean roughly the same thing. They're an absence of trust, a lack of confidence or faith. Now, all of these definitions are different, but they do have some similarities. Most definitions of trust or distrust or mistrust talk about faith or belief. Most definitions also talk about evidence, but they specifically mention a lack of evidence. Now, this is interesting because that means that trust is based on faith. If you think about the most famous trust exercise, what can you think of? What's that called? The trust fall, exactly. For those of you that aren't familiar with the trust fall, person A stands facing away from person B who's behind them, and person A falls backwards, trusting that person B will catch them in their arms. That's a great example of trust based on faith. Now, it wouldn't work if the first person was facing the second person, because then they'd have visual input. They'd have senses that show them that the person's there. It's not really an example of blind faith or trust. That's why they face away, and that's why trust is based on faith, predominantly, mostly. But trust can also be based on many other things as well. Sometimes trust is based on emotions. Some people say that emotions are a side effect, an output of emotions. Somebody says love or comfort or safety may beget trust. They may say, I love this person and therefore I trust them. I feel safe around this person and therefore I trust them. Some people believe that trust itself is a distinct, discrete emotion. Some people say that trust is based on intuition. It's in your gut. It's not something that's come through logic or reasoning. It's more instinctual. Some people say that trust is based on authority. If there's somebody that has a certain reputation, you may trust that person, and therefore you trust the things that that person says or does based on their reputation. Some people say that trust is based on society, societal expectations, cultural norms, those types of things. If everybody does it, there must be something to it. Some people base their trust on those types of things. Some people say that trust is partly based on experience. If something is transparent, a process, and you can see how it works, it might be more trustworthy than an opaque process that you can't see the inner workings. What about something that's reliable or dependable or consistent? Those might be things that are more trustworthy than something that's unreliable or inconsistent. Finally, what about dependability? I depend on this person, and I know that they're dependable and reliable. They're competent. Those might be trustworthy people rather than someone that's incompetent or not dependable. So somebody says, well, wait, isn't experience just a type of evidence? Sure, it's empirical evidence. There's many different types of evidence. Empirical evidence is through observation and personal experience rather than through theory and logic, but there's anecdotal evidence, expert evidence. Those can be a part of a foundation of trust as well. Now, most often it's a mix. It's predominantly based on faith, You can never have trust that doesn't have some element of faith in it, but it could also be a mix of authority or societal elements or evidence, direct evidence that you've experienced yourself. Not a comprehensive list. Can anybody else suggest things that aren't on this list that you think might influence or affect your sense of trust? Yes? Reports from other people, so secondhand reports. Somebody says, I trust this person, and you trust them, therefore, by transitive property, you trust the third person as well. That's a great example, yes. Any others? All right, so with that addition, it's a comprehensive list. Now, I saw a hand back there. Do you have a relationship? Talk more about that. What do you mean? You have a solid relationship with someone, and therefore you inherently trust them. Wrong. Okay, let's move on. No, that's a great, in fact, I talk about that specifically later. That's a wonderful answer. Yes, if you trust someone already, then that's a great basis for trust, a relationship to that person. And I'm going to speak specifically about that. So again, trust can be based on many things. Predominantly, mostly, it's based on faith, but it can be infused with many other elements as well. So maybe a better definition of trust is predominantly faith-based confidence and beliefs in the absence of sufficient information. Now, this sounds like a heuristic because trust is a type of heuristic. Heuristics are mental shortcuts that our brain uses to help us make decisions, solve problems more quickly, and they're reasonable solutions. They're fallible, though. Heuristics can fail, same thing that trust can fail. Sometimes you might trust someone, and it turns out that they were untrustworthy. So heuristics are not infallible, but they allow us to move forward in the world. Can you imagine if you had to logically and rationally analyze every decision in a day? It would be impossible. You'd reach analysis paralysis. It's impossible to reasonably analyze every single thing that you think, do, or say. So you definitely rely on trust. So trust seems to be well defined at this point, but let's compare it against evidence-based knowledge. On one hand, you have faith-based trust. It's predominantly based in faith. But again, just like trust itself is a continuum, there's a continuum here. You can have something that's very much based on faith, but also a little bit of authority. You can have something that's authority, your trust is based on authority, but also some evidence and some personal experience. So you can have a mixture, but the more evidence that you get, the more you move towards the right, and your belief is based on evidence-based knowledge. Now, some people call knowledge a justified true belief. This knowledge allows us to move forward in the world when trust is insufficient. So, I think I've defined it. We've talked about what trust is. Is it important? Is trust important? I think so. I think trust is important first and foremost to individuals, to yourself. Do you trust yourself? I trust myself, mostly. I can't always keep Oreos in the house because I don't trust myself not to eat them, but I trust myself. It's important to trust yourself first and foremost for your mental health and well-being, but also for your relationships with others. Trust is important as we deal with others. It helps with conflict resolution. It helps with emotional safety. And not just in personal relationships with your family and friends, but with your professional relationships as well, with coworkers and bosses. Leadership. Trust is important to leadership. If a leader is transparent and consistent and reliable, it's likely that their employees will trust them more than a leader that's not transparent or unreliable. And leaders are part of businesses. Trust is absolutely important to businesses. Employees should trust the company that they work for. They'll be more productive, they'll have longevity, they won't want to leave. Businesses rely on trust working with other businesses, vendors and partners. It's unlikely that two businesses that don't trust each other are going to work well with each other. And of course, trust is important with customers as well. If a customer doesn't trust a business, it's unlikely that they will buy their product, and therefore you're going to have lack of financial stability. So indirectly, trust affects the bottom line. Trust is also important to innovation and collaboration. Innovation is about taking risks. If you're in an environment where you feel that you're trusted to take risks, it's safe, you're more likely to be innovative. And if you're in an environment, we talked about relationships with coworkers, where you feel that you can trust them with your communication, then it's more easy to collaborate and cooperate with them. So trust influences innovation and collaboration. Trust is even bigger. It influences technology. Of course, things like cybersecurity, that's an obvious one. But even maybe less obvious things like your car or an elevator, the alarm clock. I trusted my iPhone this morning to wake me up. I didn't know that it would wake me up, but I had a lot of evidence based on prior use of it, and I trusted that the alarm clock would go off at the right time and I wouldn't be late. Trust is even important to entire nations. In order to govern our people, for law and order, the citizens need to trust their leaders. And it's important with nation diplomacy, nation to nation. Nations should trust each other. This seems to be in the news a lot right now. How much does one nation trust another? Now, speaking of news right now, there was a little election recently. Does anybody think that trust was an important aspect of this recent U.S. election? Absolutely. Trust was a very, very important topic. So trust is important in many, many different ways. And I think so, but I'm not the only one. Here's a quote from Stephen Covey, the author. He says, "Trust is the glue of life." Now, he's obviously very famous for writing that 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, but he also has a book called The Speed of Trust, the one thing that changes everything. And it's full of great quotes on trust. This is one that I particularly like. Trust is the glue of life. And if you think about glue, it's something that holds other things together. And without glue, things can fall apart. In this case, life can fall apart. So I really like this quote, reminding me about the importance of trust, at least in the opinion of Stephen Covey. But it's not a new idea. It's very old. Here's Thomas Hobbes in 1651. He wrote Leviathan, and in that there was the quote, "Trust is one of the principal forces which binds society together." Again, this concept of holding things together, in this case it's society. So another reminder that trust is very important. George MacDonald, he says, to be trusted, he's a Scottish author, to be trusted is a greater compliment than being loved. Wow. Some people consider love the most important thing. And George says trust is even more important. This goes back to the idea of trust being either a byproduct or an emotion itself. So these are people that definitely think that trust is important. I've obviously given you some reasons in different ways that I think trust is important, but I'm interested in what you think. Is trust important? You don't have to answer just that question. I heard a yes already. I'm glad to hear that. But what are your thoughts? Tell me why you think trust is important, or perhaps why you think trust is not important. Or tell something related to this idea. I'm interested to hear from you right now. Yes?
Well, I never have perfect knowledge, so at some point I just have to accept what it is and trust that it's going to work out.
You never have perfect knowledge, so you have to rely on trust to some degree. In that red-blue arrow, the continuum, you're right, you can never go all the way to the right. No one can have perfect knowledge. It's impossible. There's always some element, even if it's small, of trust. So that's a great reason, yes. If you don't trust people, you might be afraid to share ideas. Absolutely. That goes back to the collaboration, cooperation, the feeling safe. Absolutely. That's a great observation. Others? Yes? You trust your kids. All right, this is where we part ways. No, I love my kids and I trust my kids. So you trust your kids as well. Why do you trust your kids? I've asked a difficult question. I'll let you think on that one. I trust my kids as well, and part of it is based on prior experience. It's a known, familiar situation. They've established trust in the beginning, so it continues until they break that sense of trust. That's one reason that I trust my children. Other observations, notes, comments? Yes? Absolutely. It helps you make decisions. Again, if you had to rationally go through your day trying to make logical decisions, you'd reach analysis paralysis. In another talk, I talk about the importance of emotions with regards to decision making. And emotions are very, very essential to helping us make decisions. If you're unable to feel or express emotions, it's almost impossible to make decisions. And as I said, some people believe that trust itself is an emotion, and therefore they seem related. Without trust, it's going to be very, very difficult to move forward in life and make decisions. Great observation. Others? These are great. Yes?
I tend to trust people until they prove they cannot be trusted. However, I recognize that there's a lot of risk. One of the most painful moments of my life have been violations of trust.
Oh, very good. Violations of trust. You trust them until you can't any longer, till they've broken that bond of trust. And it can be painful, and there's a lot of risk. Yeah, even after our sense of trust is broken, it might be difficult to get back on that horse and trust again, but we still do it. We're humans. Trust is essential to helping us move forward in the world. Excellent observation. Thank you. Any others? One more, yes. Trust allows you to hear someone out and process the feedback, that you're patient in allowing them to speak and listen. Is that what you're saying? Okay, I absolutely agree. If you don't trust someone, you might want to talk over top of them, or you're preparing an answer, not listening you're listening to respond rather than to intake. I agree with that. That's fantastic. So these are great observations about trust. I think it's important. Historically, many people think it's important, and I seem to think that you think it's important. And I guarantee after this talk today, you'll start to notice the word trust popping up more and more and more. It might have gone through one ear and out the other before, but now it'll stick in the middle in your brain, and you'll say, wow, I need to pay more attention to trust. So trust is definitely important. We've defined it, explained it a little bit. It's important. But is it always enough? Well, sometimes. Sometimes trust is sufficient. There's certain situations and contexts. Sometimes trust is enough if the evidence is expensive or scarce or absent. I mentioned an elevator earlier. Anyone ever ridden an elevator? I don't need hands. We've all ridden elevators. Now, before you rode the elevator, did you call the company and check the schematics and ask to see the testing reports and talk to the workers that installed the elevator? Because then you'd have evidence and know whether that elevator is safe to ride or not. You might be able to do those things, but it's going to be very expensive, maybe monetarily, but also with time. So it might be unreasonable to go about gathering evidence in order to ride an elevator. Instead, maybe that's a situation when trust is enough. Maybe the elevator manufacturer has gone out of business and you can't contact them. So it's not about being expensive or scarce. The evidence is absent. You can't get it even if you wanted to. That's a situation when you simply must rely on trust. That's when trust is enough. What about if you're in a known or familiar situation? You mentioned something about this, and as well as you. If you're in a situation where trust has already been established, this prior means, and you're going to interact with this person or this product or this thing again, you say, I already trust it, but now I want to start gathering evidence. Maybe it doesn't make sense. Maybe you can continue that trust line because you're in a known or familiar situation. Some context, religious, blind faith. Religion, by definition, is all about trust. So this is a context when trust is absolutely enough because it's difficult to gather evidence with regards to religion. What about artistic? Sometimes artists are more concerned with making a mental or emotional connection with other artists or their audience rather than an evidence-based connection. So sometimes artistic contexts are a situation when trust is enough. What about cultural? I mentioned societal expectations and cultural norms. Things are handed down generation to generation, traditions. And maybe if my grandfather did it and his grandfather did it, I trust them, and therefore I trust this thing through a cultural aspect. Maybe that's one way that trust is enough in that particular situation. And of course, there's many personal and professional and technological ways that you could probably think of that trust is sufficient. It's fine. One thing that many of these situations and contexts have in common is that they're low risk. If you're in a situation and something really, really, really bad might happen if you act, but it's super unlikely for that really bad thing to happen, maybe trust is sufficient. You can move forward. Or maybe if something is very, very likely to go wrong, but it's not a big deal if it does, you can rely on trust. There's no need to gather evidence. But it follows if trust is appropriate sometimes and sufficient sometimes, it also follows that sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes the evidence is cheap. Sometimes it's abundant and readily available. Think about crossing a street. You're about to cross a busy street, and you have evidence such as the crosswalk sign or the stoplights and the cars. You can see them, and you can hear them with their horns and their engines, and you see other people crossing or stopping. There's tons of evidence that you can intake and inform your decision whether it's safe to cross the street. Or you could close your eyes and cover your ears and say, I trust that it's safe. Probably not a great situation to rely on trust. Maybe that's a situation when trust is not enough, and you should base your actions on evidence as well. What about unknown or unfamiliar situations? You're in a situation working with a new person or a new company or a new product. Maybe in that situation, you haven't established a sense of trust, and so it behooves you to gather evidence and make your decisions and your thoughts and your actions based on evidence instead, in case something goes wrong, if it's a high-risk situation. In some contexts, legal, let's talk about trusting too much and too little. In this context, in the United States, it's shown, many studies have shown that eyewitness testimony is unreliable. It's not a very good thing. It's very unreliable eyewitness testimony. But in the United States, eyewitness testimony alone is sufficient to convict. If a judge and jury deems that some particular witness is trustworthy, then their testimony alone is sufficient to put someone in jail. Has anyone heard of the Innocence Project? It's a group that looks for convicted folks that are incarcerated, and they try and find people that were wrongly convicted, wrongly incarcerated. And as of 2020, in 69% of the DNA exonerations. In other words, they found DNA evidence that showed that this person was innocent, and this DNA evidence was not available before. In 69% of the time, the person was in jail and wrongly incarcerated because of incorrect eyewitness testimony. Yikes. That's a situation where I think trusting too much might have disastrous consequences. You trusted what this person said on the stand, and therefore someone went to jail incorrectly. What about trusting too little? Have you heard of jury nullification? Jury nullification is when a group of jurors decide to acquit and vote not guilty, even though they believe that the defendant is guilty. There's a lot of evidence showing that they're guilty, but they still choose to vote not guilty. There's a lot of different reasons that jury nullification happens, but in a 2013 interview with one such jury that had a jury nullification, the juror said, "I didn't trust the DA's office or the court system. I would have voted innocent no matter what." That's a lack of trust. This is a situation when trust might not be enough in this context. What about medical? Anyone go to the doctor and get a diagnosis? Of course. Has anyone ever had a second opinion? The second opinion might show that you are basing your decision on a second opinion, more evidence rather than just saying, "I trust you, doc. What you said is probably right." We don't always get second opinions. It depends on what their opinion is and what the situation is, but sometimes we get second opinions. If you heard, of course, about Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes, that is a situation where many people trusted Theranos to create these blood tests that were valid and truthful. And in fact, they were not. They were fake, and many people based their health decisions on these fake blood tests, and it had disastrous consequences. They trusted in this medical context too much. What about in financial context? Bernie Madoff. Many people trusted Bernie with their money. They did get a lot of money to his Ponzi scheme, and they lost fortunes. So this is a situation where sometimes trust might not be enough. You might want to base your financial decisions more on evidence rather than blind faith. And of course, there's many other contexts as well. Personal, professional technology. You could probably think of personal, professional, and technology examples in your own mind where trust was not enough. You wanted to gather evidence before moving forward. The common theme across many of these things is they're high risk. Sometimes you're in a situation where something is really, really, really bad. You're going to make a decision, but if it goes badly, it's going to be really bad, and it's super likely. Now, you might leave it up to trust and blind faith. Sometimes you have to if the evidence is scarce or absent. But if you're able, you might want to choose a high-risk situation to base your decision and action on knowledge instead. So high-risk situations is when trust might not be enough. So trust is sometimes sufficient to move forward. Sometimes it's insufficient. It's unwise to rely just on trust alone. What do you do when trust is not enough? You trust but verify. Hey, he said the name of the talk in the talk. Trust but verify. This is an old Roman proverb that was made famous by Ronald Reagan. Trust but verify. It's a cute little pithy phrase, and when you say it, people go, ooh, deep. But what's it actually mean? So I'm here to talk more about, we've already talked a lot about trust, but what does the but verify mean? How do you verify something if you trust it as well? Through skepticism. Now, skepticism is another big topic, just like trust. It's very complex, very complicated, it's unsettled, it's been debated and discussed for centuries. I'm going to talk a little bit about one perspective and some of the commonalities that rise to the top. So skepticism is very, very important. Skepticism comes from the root Greek word skeptomai, which means to seek out, to look for, to examine. So I think that's pretty interesting that the root origin of the word means to seek information, to seek knowledge. Now, skepticism, very frequently, in my personal experience, I consider myself a trustworthy person, a trusting person, but I also consider myself a skeptic. Sometimes I put it in my biographies. And in my experience, sometimes skeptics and skepticism is associated with cynicism or pessimism. Sometimes skeptics, such as myself, were seen as suspicious or maybe even jaded. These are not attractive qualities. These are not desirable things to be seen as. Sometimes I tell people, oh, I'm a skeptic, and they go, oh, that's too bad. I think that that's unfair. In fact, skepticism is about uncertainty. It's uncertainty for reservations about something. It's a neutral stance that suspends belief until justified evidence is available. So, in reality, skepticism and skeptics aren't about pessimism. They're not about being jaded or cynical. In fact, skepticism should be more closely aligned with caution, with being open-minded. Skeptics should be seen as someone that's curious. That is a more reasonable, based on the definitions, view of skepticism and skeptics. I think the term has been hijacked and unfairly used and turned into a four-letter dirty word for so long that skepticism becomes a negative trait, when in fact, it's a wonderful place to start, a place of uncertainty. Now, some of you are saying, wait a second, uncertainty doesn't sound so great either. I agree. It can be a little anxiety-inducing, for sure. But if you're uncertain, it's not the end. It's the start point. Here's a great quote from Margaret Drabble, the author. She says, "When nothing is sure, everything is possible." So if you have a decision to make or a problem to solve, and you realize that you're in a situation that's high risk and trust is insufficient and you need to gather evidence, you approach it with skepticism, that's not the end. Right now you're in the middle, and you have the entire world of possibilities in front of you to gather evidence and make decisions. That, to me, is a hopeful stance. This is why I really believe in skepticism. So I've defined it, I've talked a little bit about it. Let's give you some more examples, practical examples about exactly what skepticism is. Skepticism is verifying facts, cross-checking with other sources, seeking alternate views. Why is this important? Because there's bad information out there. Some people say that we're in the age of misinformation. There's a lot of bad information, and there's a lot of reasons for bad information. Sometimes bad information comes from bad actors. They're there to be malicious, to deceive you intentionally. That's one source of bad information. Sometimes it's just erroneous. Somebody forgot something, or they made a mistake. Sometimes it's outdated. It was right at the time, but it's since been proven wrong and no one has updated it. There's a lot of different reasons that information can be bad, but the point is it exists, and there's a lot of it. The sources could be books. Maybe you're reading an old book that's outdated and you read some bad information, or a newspaper or a news channel, TV stations. You're watching one source versus another. There's bad information that's all over the place. Your crazy uncle that talks about conspiracy theories, your coworkers that are saying crazy stuff. There's all sorts of sources of potential bad information. Now, not all books and newspapers and news channels and uncles are bad, but they have the potential to accidentally or maliciously provide bad information, and you want to protect yourself against that. Now, there's one more source of bad information, potentially bad information, AI. What do they call bad information with regards to AI? Hallucinations, of course. Now, this is an old term. Traditionally, hallucination has meant the perception of something that's not actually real, not actually there. With regards to AI, the idea of hallucination, that term has been applied to AI since around 2010 and only formally added to dictionaries in 2023. So the idea or word hallucination connected with AI is relatively new, but it's not a new idea. In the 80s, there was an AI project called Cyc, C-Y-C, run by Douglas Lynott. And the way that this program worked, very roughly, is researchers would feed facts and information to Cyc all day long, pumping in fact after fact after fact, piece of information. And then they would ask Cyc to make correlations between like pieces of information. It would run all night, and the researchers would come in the morning, and they'd say, all right, Cyc, what discoveries have you made? And it would say, well, I know the fact that water is wet, and I know the fact that rain is made of water, and I've correlated those and says, when it rains, things get wet. I say, great, that's a great correlation. You came up with that on your own based on these two distinct, disparate facts. But there's a famous one called Fred while shaving. Cyc wasn't always right. Fred while shaving was a good exemplar of an early hallucination. Cyc knew that razors are sometimes made of electric razors. They're not always just plastic things, sometimes they're electrically driven. Cyc also knew that Fred is a man and men shave, so it had these different facts. It put together, one of its conclusions was that when Fred is shaving and holding an electric razor, Fred becomes electric himself. That's wrong, so they had to wipe that from the database, explain to Cyc why that was incorrect, but that's a very, very early example of hallucination from the 80s. So it's not a new concept. It's been around for a long time with regards to AI, but it's still around with us today. Numbers are constantly changing with the proliferation and new releases of AI, but as of 2024, they were talking about AIs traditionally can hallucinate between 5 and 10% of the time, sometimes up to 27% of the time, depending on the model and the different AI that you're using. However, if you were working with someone and you knew that they provided you bad information a quarter of the time, you might be wary to work with or trust that person. Or if you're reading a book or watching a news station, you know that roughly 25% of the time they're giving you bad information. You might be more careful about trusting that news source. Now, what about AI? How many people copy and paste without verifying facts? This is why skepticism is about verifying facts. If your uncle tells you something crazy, go verify that fact with your aunt. It's about cross-checking with other sources. If you hear something weird on a news channel, go listen to another news channel. If you read a newspaper or talk to a coworker, seek an alternate view from that other newspaper, news channel, coworker. This is how skepticism can help you gain evidence and knowledge and make better decisions. Here's a great quote. Never trust anything that can think for itself if you can't see where it keeps its brain. This is from Harry Potter. He's talking about the Marauders map, but I also like to think that this quote, to some degree, applies to AI. We're not exactly sure how it thinks, where it keeps its brain, but maybe we should be wary about trusting it sometimes. Skepticism is being aware of and managing potential biases in the source and in self. Biases, cognitive biases, are shortcuts. I said that trust itself is a type of heuristic. Cognitive biases are shortcuts that our minds take in order to help us move forward. They're shortcuts that allow us to come to reasonable solutions more quickly than using rational thought and logic. Now, we all have cognitive biases, and very often, they're sometimes helpful, very often they're unfair, especially if they lead to prejudices and stereotypes. So cognitive biases are very, very dangerous. And the worst part is they're in all of us and we can't get rid of them. It's the way that the brain is biologically created. It helps us move forward in the world without sufficient information. We use cognitive biases and heuristics to make decisions. But if you can't get rid of them and they can sometimes be harmful, what can you do? You can be aware of them. And once you're aware of something, then you can manage that thing. How do you become aware of biases? A great start is Wikipedia. There's a huge list of cognitive biases. And the more you read about these things, the more that you'll start to recognize them. You'll say, boy, I really prefer this over that. Wait a second. I know about recency bias. Do I prefer this over that because that's the more recent thing and that's the older thing? Possibly. It may cause you to pause. You say, oh, I prefer my candidate over your candidate. Well, that's choice supportive bias. Is it just because that's your candidate? Are you blind to the benefits and advantages of the other candidate as well? So if you're aware of these cognitive biases, you'll start to recognize them, and once you recognize them, you can be aware of them. Same thing with AI. If AI gives you an output, you might pause and say, wait a second, is there any bias in here? Where might that bias come from? Perhaps from the data. If there's bias in us and we can't eliminate it, maybe bias is baked into the data as well. You ask an AI a question, it produces an answer. You might pause and say, wait a second, is there any AI bias that's in the answer that I'm reading right now? There's a lot of examples of this. You can go and look for yourself. One example is Amazon was using AI to vet resumes. So they trained their data set on tens of thousands of resumes, fed in lots and lots of resumes, and then they turned it loose and said, new resumes that come in, we're going to run it through this AI engine to make sure that we can vet out the ones that aren't of a certain quality. After a while, they found out that the AI was preferring men's resumes over women's. They dug into it and said, why is this? Turns out the tens of thousands of resumes that it was trained on were mostly male resumes. Therefore, there was an inherent bias that came from the data, and it was giving bad answers, biased answers. So sometimes skepticism, being aware of and managing potential biases in your source and self. How can you accomplish this with AI? Sometimes you can't see the data. Sometimes you can't see the model. But if you at least pause and say, could this answer that I'm getting from AI be erroneous? Could this be bad information? Then you might be able to act on it and manage it. Everyone is a prisoner of their own experience. No one can eliminate prejudices. Just recognize them, and that's the first step towards managing them. Thanks, Edward. Skepticism is pausing. Sometimes pausing is a great, great step towards coming towards a more enlightened, reasonable solution. Sometimes acting too quickly, you can come to bad conclusions. Inadequate understanding. Trying to solve a problem before you sufficiently understand it. And sufficiently understanding sometimes takes a moment. It takes time. So pausing is an effective strategy and part of what skepticism is. So next time that you ask AI an answer and it responds, rather than quickly cutting and pasting, pause for a second. Reflect. Think, does this make sense? Could there be biases that are affecting it? Should I check with other sources? Pausing itself seems so simple, but it's a very effective strategy and part of what skeptical mindset is. Almost everything will work again if you unplug it for a few minutes, including you. I like that. Sometimes I pause and reflect on my own thoughts to make sure that I'm not biased. Skepticism is crafting and asking good questions. If I'm asking my uncle a question and he gives me a bad answer, maybe it's because my question in the first place was bad. It was poorly formed. It was incomplete. So perhaps my question was part of the problem with his answer. Now, asking questions is both an art and a science. There's a lot of research. People spend their careers or lives learning how to ask and craft good questions. And of course, you've heard of open versus closed-ended. Those are wide, broad umbrellas that talk about a lot of nuanced types of questions that have binary responses or limited responses versus more verbose responses. And asking good questions is about avoiding loaded questions and leading questions and double-barreled questions. And it's about asking meta questions, questions about questions, and follow-up questions. There's all sorts of different ways that you can ask surveys and Likert scale and ordinal ranking and rating. Asking questions is an art and a science. So if you're asking bad questions of your uncle or your coworker, it's a good chance that you're going to get a bad answer back. Now, what do they call asking questions in the context of AI? Prompt engineering, prompting, yes. There's a whole industry around that now. I'm a prompt engineer. You can get hired for this. Hired for asking questions, essentially. Now, it's a different art and science. There's one-shot, multi-shot, there's boundaries, you can give exemplars, there's all sorts of techniques and approaches to being a good prompt engineer, to being a good question asker in the context of AI. So if you're asking AI weak questions, it's likely that you're going to get weak, maybe misinformation back. But if you're asking clever, well-crafted questions, it's more likely you'll get better answers back from your AI. So crafting and asking good questions is very important. There are no right answers to wrong questions. I love this quote from Ursula Le Guin. She's an author. And I have another quote. A prudent question is one half of wisdom. That's fantastic. You want to try and gain some wisdom, you better make sure that your question is part of the equation. Finally, skepticism is practicing and developing critical skills. Skiing is a skill. Drawing is a skill. Coding is a skill. And in order to develop a skill, practice is absolutely important. Practice doesn't make perfect, it makes permanent. I like that much better. So if you're doing bad practice, it will cement those bad practices. But if you're doing good practice, it will help you get better at that skill. Critical thinking is a skill. Your brain is a muscle, and it behooves you to exercise that muscle. So if you're interested in developing a skeptical mindset and developing your critical thinking, practice. Now, how do you practice? Puzzles, maybe word puzzles, brain teasers, those types of things, strategy games, debates and discussions. Talk with other people, ask them open-ended questions, so you have them ask you open-ended questions, so your mind is working. If you're debating, take the opposing position, something you don't believe in. That's a fantastic way to exercise your critical thinking skills. Read a book, man. Books are a fantastic way to increase your critical thinking skills and practice. Reflective thinking, again, pausing before you respond to say, does this make sense? It's about epistemology. How do I know what I know? All of this is a form of practice, and the more you practice, the more you'll increase this skill called critical thinking and skepticism. There are so many notable quotes about the importance of practice, I couldn't decide which one to include. That's from me. This is obvious. People know that practice is important. I don't have to beat that in. But it also is important with regards to AI. The more you use it, the more you're going to get better at using AI more effective and efficiently. So skepticism, I've talked about it, explained it, given you some tips on how to develop your skeptical mindset and critical thinking skills. Is it important? I think so. It encourages critical thinking. It challenges assumptions, deeper analysis of claims and evidence. It protects against deception. I said we're in the age of misinformation. Nobody likes to be deceived. If you're deceived, you can be taken advantage of. You can be manipulated. Nobody likes those things. This can help you protect yourself against deception. Through asking questions and challenging assumptions and coming to better conclusions. It prevents dogmatism. Dogmatism is accepting principles as undeniably true without any regard for evidence or opinions. It's unwavering. Dogmatism is very rigid. It's not necessarily a good position all the time. Dogmatism can be very harmful. Skepticism can prevent that and protect you against that by having you question things and having an open mind. Fosters open-mindedness. There it is. It fosters open-mindedness. Open-mindedness is part of being skeptical. It's about curiosity and proceeding with caution. Skepticism is important because it encourages evidence-based decision-making, which could be important if you're in a high-risk situation. Some contexts say that trust is insufficient and therefore an evidence-based decision is better, and skepticism can help with that, which is why it's important. So there are two ways to slide easily through life, to believe everything or to doubt everything. Both ways save us from thinking. I love this quote from Alfred. Let's call him Alfred K. I like this quote because, sure, thinking takes a lot of effort, and it might be slower up front, but in the end, it could prevent deception, misinformation, it could protect you. So a little bit of extra work up front could help you in the end. It's the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. This comes from Aristotle, so this is an old idea. This, I think, is the beautiful quote, the crux of what skepticism is. Entertain a thought without accepting it. Somebody tells me something and I say, I'm skeptical. They go, oh, that's too bad. You're pessimistic. You doubt it. I say, I don't doubt it. I'm skeptical. I'm uncertain. I'm at a neutral stance right now, and the world, I have a world of possibilities before me. I am entertaining the thought, considering it, thinking about it, without accepting it or rejecting it. That's what skepticism is. I like this. And this is just a fun one from Carl Sagan. It pays to keep an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out. I like that. Cute and pithy. So I've talked about what skepticism is, defined it, given you some tips. I've talked about why I think it's important, why other people, famous people, think it's important. But what about you? I've asked you about trust. What are your opinions and thoughts and definitions and stories about skepticism? Yes?
You were talking about AI.
Mm-hmm. Go on.
Make sure that your AI is doing it correctly. So, like, find the evidence, right?
So you associate, when I was talking about skepticism with regards to AI, you thought about testing. And I was a career tester for 25 years, 15 companies, quality assurance, this was my business. So I appreciate that answer very, very much. I think about testing and quality very often in my daily life. And I agree. If you want to increase your confidence in something, testing is a fantastic way. So being skeptical is a form of testing. I would agree with that. That seems reasonable. Other observations or comments about skepticism? Yes?
I really liked all that you said about skepticism and being open-minded, but I agree that I had a very negative reaction towards skepticism, and I'm wondering where that comes from. Why did skepticism become a bad thing?
Okay, first let's focus on the compliment that you just gave me. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Second, you did have a negative reaction to the word skepticism, and you're wondering, where did that originate? It's difficult. I'm also an armchair linguist and semanticist. I love wordplay and language. And words and meaning evolve. They belong to the people. They're coined, and protologism and neologisms, and they evolve and they live and die. They're living things, words and language. And meaning is part of all that. And where did it come from? I can't rightly say. Perhaps some people believe that maybe they have an agenda to push. And if their paycheck or their motivation is some agenda pushing it, and you come in and say, well, I'm not sure, I have a neutral stance, and they say, no, I just need you to be loyal, I need you to accept this and don't question it. Those might be people that put a bad spin on skepticism. And maybe if they're vocal enough and you hear it enough, maybe that's one way. I'm just spitballing here. Maybe that's one way that skepticism has received this bad reputation. Yes? Verifying is a lot harder than trusting. Absolutely agree. I think that goes back to a couple quotes ago. Let me see if I can go back to it here. 2 ways to slide easily through life. Believe everything or doubt everything, and essentially trust. Or both ways save us from thinking. Thinking is absolutely hard. Verifying is absolutely hard. So I'm asking you to do something a little bit more difficult, but it's not because there's no benefit. I think that in high-risk situations, especially in some contexts, it will save you from misery, from negative outcomes. So yeah, it's a little more work, or you can end up just accepting the consequences. If your risk appetite is sufficient, then trust is probably more sufficient and appropriate for you in more other situations. I agree with you. Yes, others. Yes.
Follow on from that point, you can't be a skeptic about everything. You don't have enough energy.
You cannot be a skeptic about everything, you just don't have the energy. Absolutely agree, and I think you're going to like a slide in a few clicks here. Yes, I absolutely agree with that. You can't be skeptical about every single thing. There's not enough time, not enough energy to analyze everything, right? And that's why I said, somebody else said earlier, it's impossible to have perfect information, to be all the way at the right-hand side. There's always some degree of trust. Deciding how much trust, that's the tricky part. And when it's appropriate, that's the tricky part. So I think you're going to like this slide because it speaks to that. Any other last observations? I'll go 2 more. Yes? So Part of skepticism receiving a bad reputation might be how it's received. If someone tells you something and you respond to it skeptically and say, I'm not quite sure, that person might take it as an affront to their sense of trust, right? I totally agree. So it's very, very delicate ground. Maybe that's another reason that skepticism has received a bad name. And you might reassure that person, say, it's not that I don't trust you, I'm trusting, but verifying. This is a high-risk situation. I know that you're saying invest with Bernie Madoff, but man, this is all my money. I really feel like I trust you, but I'd also like to verify in this situation. One more comment?
I just wanted to say that it is based on impact versus trust and skeptical both feelings. Because if the impact is bigger, you really try to apply this feeling. If there is not much impact, you just let it.
Absolutely. Trust and skepticism are both very much dependent on the impact, the outcome. I agree with that. All right, let's move on here. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. These are all fantastic. So, the gentleman right here talked about that skepticism is not always possible. So I agree with that. And also, how does it relate to trust? Let's start at the top. We talked about trust being sufficient in some situations and insufficient, inappropriate in other situations. So let's go one direction in this little flow chart. Is trust enough? You say, yeah, I'm in a low-risk situation. It's a nothing burger if something bad happens, or it's super bad, but it's not likely to happen. I'm in an artistic context, or whatever the situation. I've determined that in this situation, I can't verify that the elevator is safe, so I'm just going to trust it. Trust is enough. The next question is, are you practicing skepticism? Are you questioning and challenging assumptions and gathering evidence? If you're not, well, that makes sense. You've already determined through the blue triangle there, you're on this path, that trust is sufficient in this situation. There's no reason to challenge things. You're in a known, familiar situation. It's low risk. It's fine. That makes sense. But what if you are challenging and trying to gather evidence even after you've established that trust is enough? You could be viewed as suspicious and cynical. Maybe this is some way that skeptics get a bad name. Maybe there's people that say, I am a self-proclaimed skeptic, and I'm in a trusting situation, and I'm still going to practice skepticism. I'm going to challenge your ideas and question your assumptions, even though it's low risk. Somebody says, man, you sure are pessimistic. You sure are cynical. Now, that can lead to all types of problems. Analysis paralysis. If you're practicing skepticism when it's inappropriate, trying to do it all the time, trying to gather evidence, it's impossible. You may be paralyzed by analysis. It can lead to stress, inefficiencies. There's all sorts of bad things that can happen if you follow this path. And maybe that's how skeptics get a bad name. Let's go the other direction. Is trust enough? Sometimes the answer is no, it's not enough. You're in a high-risk situation. Some company called Theranos says, we have a brand new blood test, we're going to run it for you, and you say, boy, the results of this blood test determine which route I take with my health care. Okay. Well, are you practicing skepticism? You say, this is a huge decision. I really should check with another doctor, another blood testing facility to make sure that this makes sense, because this is a high-risk situation. So are you practicing skepticism? Yes. You're challenging. You're seeking other sources. You're verifying facts, alternate views, second opinions. That makes sense. This is a wise way to use skepticism. But what if you're in this situation where trust is not enough, it's a high-risk situation, and you're not asking, you're not seeking, you're not questioning? You could be viewed as gullible, as naive. And bad things happen there. You could be manipulated. You could be taken advantage of. I don't have a whole lot of sympathy for somebody that invested with Bernie Madoff, and I say, boy, did you check him out before? They said, no, I trusted the guy. I just gave him all my money. I go, I don't know about that. This seems like a pretty big decision just to base on trust. You might view that person as cynical or naive, and bad things happen. So, healthy skepticism. Healthy, this is not a dictionary term, but the word healthy is an adjective, is a modifier. It means apt or suitable, appropriate. Healthy skepticism is suitable. It's appropriate. It's an approach that questions claims and ideas when appropriate and uses evidence to evaluate their validity. Skepticism, just like trust, isn't always appropriate, but sometimes it's wise and preferable. So what? So hopefully I've supported the idea that trusting and verifying is very important. Trust is very important. I think I've supported that idea. I think it's important. Famous people think it's important. You think it's important. Even though it's important, it's not always sufficient. Sometimes it's enough, but sometimes it's not enough. And when it's not enough, healthy skepticism can help. Critical thinking, challenging ideas. Hopefully, I've supported the idea that trust but verify is important. I've explained that idea to you. I'm going to leave you with this quote. It comes from the governor of Maryland, Wes Moore. He says, I want skepticism to be your companion and not your captor. I really like that quote. I like to think skepticism is my co-pilot through life. And if you lead your life and go through life with skepticism, things should be better. Trust me. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.